Welcome to our Purple Team Dialogues podcast.
With Steve Townsley and Richard Gold, a cybersecurity podcast focused on both offensive and defensive security. Okay, hi, I am Richard Gold, and welcome to Purple Team Dialogues with my co-host, Steve Townsley.
Today we're going to talk about Jeep Flea Market, that classic cybersecurity issue.
Yeah, and I think this one is going to be very interesting for a lot of different reasons. One of the things that is very interesting also about this, which we'll touch on in just a sec, is where it all came from. But effectively, this is the NSA, National Security Agency and the Tailored Access Operations outfit there, breaking into one of the SWIFT service bureaus, so a company which handles SWIFT transactions on behalf of customers. And all of this stuff got leaked on the internet by the ShadowBrokers. Now, with your source evaluation hat on, Steve, what do you make of all of that?
It's a good question, and as always, good to start with looking at the source. So we highly think that the ShadowBrokers are the Russian government, so trying to embarrass the US government by gathering this data and leaking it online. Difficult to falsify, I think, if you go through the leak itself, and if you come from a government background and you've dealt with top secret material before, it feels quite naughty to see it on your own computer. It was quite wrong, but
I think I used to troll you when we worked together by printing out documents from the Snowden leaks and leaving them on your desk.
Here's some TS strap material just hanging around in my office in the private sector. Awful, just awful. And there's a lot of technical detail as well in the leaks, wasn't there? I think about not just exploit material, but spreadsheets that they're obviously using as part of the operation and showing which machines they're compromised. So you're literally peering into a snapshot in the middle of an NSA tailored access operation, which is really cool.
And I honestly, when it came out, I thought it would never ever happen. I never thought that I would be using an NSA exploit in my dev environment. That was absolutely wild. And having this insight into an actual operation is also one of the reasons why I wanted to discuss it with you, because it's such a unique opportunity. So I thought it would be a good idea to make the most of it, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was 7 years ago?
It was a while back,
maybe? Yeah. But still really, really relevant for us today.
So this is one of the things we were talking about just beforehand. What's your view on, should I care as a, let's say, private sector organization? Should I care about nation state threat actors?
Well, I think I've often, as a blue teamer, made the mistake of saying no. You put up this, you talk about this spectrum of threats with hacktivists at one end, nation states on the other, and organized criminal groups somewhere in the middle, maybe nearer the nation state side at the moment. And instinctively, you want to say no. And also some of your stakeholders might be quite skeptical. Thinking of James Bond and the NSA and GCHQ. Why would they care about us? But what this attack, I think, shows really nicely is I can imagine a culture at this organization where they would say, well, we work in finance, in banking, we deal with the SWIFT network and transferring money. Why would a nation state be interested in us? We're not producing fighter jets or spy satellites or those things you generally associate with nation state attackers. And I'm probably going to contradict myself. It's like I've already said on a podcast, I will say in future, but there's probably more organizations than we think that should consider nation states in their threat model.
Well, one of the interesting approaches I've seen be taken is to kind of not think so much about the threat actor themselves, but rather about the TTPs. So is it a TTP which is available to a wider range of threat actors, or is it something that's only used by these very, very top tier ones? And TTPs can be something, for example, being involved in the standardization process of a cryptographic algorithm and deliberately weakening that. That to me is, that one I can totally see is not really being in scope for a lot of organizations. I mean, what the hell are you going to do about that? But exploits, well, yeah, actually, it turns out there's a lot you can do about that. And nation states, I like to think, are as lazy as the rest of us and will use the necessary thing to get the job done. You're not going to rock in there with your, top tier asset and use it for every single target, although we do see some top tier assets being used in this case. But generally speaking, you just want to use whatever gets the job done, right?
Yeah, it might have been the Grok or Swift on security or one of the other Twitter infosec fonts of knowledge. I remember them talking about, hey, nation states have KPIs and policies and objectives, and hey, they work 9 to 5, and some of them go on training courses, and like they're just normal organizations, and yeah, they want to get stuff done economically and efficiently as much as the rest of us. So I think that's a really good point. They're going to take maybe the path of least resistance if they can.
Yeah.
Why overcomplicate it? And obviously, every time you fire a 0-day, you risk potentially exposing that.
Yeah, definitely. And I think they want to play their cards very close to their chest. You see how much OPSEC they bake into their attack process here, which is, I think, a very valuable lesson for red teamers everywhere.
So let's get into the attack then. But before we do, as always, we'll be considering both the red team side, which in this case, there's lots of detail about what the attackers were doing, but also the blue team. So what did the defenders do, or what didn't they do, and what we can learn from this?
Yeah, and I think one of the sort of neat little twists we're going to follow here is that we are going to look at the blue team side through the comments of Rob Joyce, former head of NSA TAO, when he spoke at the Usenix Enigma conference a while back. And I think it was going to be quite instructive to see in his recommendations about how to disrupt nation state hackers, what would have applied in this case and what wouldn't have applied, and how you can kind of tell the difference.
Yeah, it's a really good lens, isn't it? We've got a nation state doing a thing, and then the same nation state telling us how we can defend ourselves from the thing.
Yeah, that's quite fun. So yeah, let's dig into it. I mean, we could start. I mean, this is a really interesting example of how we actually even have targeting information. There's a PowerPoint presentation inside the leak that talks about what they're up to. They're targeting Swift transactions. Obviously, it's a valuable source of financial intelligence. Who's funding who, that kind of thing. And of course, the geographical region is, of course, very, very prominent here. I don't think we need to go too much into the politics of it, but I think it's fairly obvious from.
It was Middle Eastern, wasn't it? EastNets is the Middle Eastern Swift bureau, or the main Swift bureau in the Middle East, if I understood correctly.
Correct.
So you've got this Swift network, which can be used for, doesn't transfer money, does it? But I think it signals the transfer of money between banks.
Yeah.
And then because running Swift yourself can have some overhead, you've got these Swift bureaus around the world. So I guess third parties that will do it all on your behalf.
Yeah.
And I guess you see why targeting a bureau would give you data from numerous banks.
Yeah, a lot of bang for your buck, for your exploitation buck.
Yeah, it's definitely a choke point, I guess, in the Swift network.
Yeah, and I think one of the other phrases that jumps out at me from the PowerPoint is the phrase regained access. That really, to me, was jumped out of that persistence aspect, which pops up so many times in the whole discussion of APTs. But when you see it written down like that, you can see that it's just, they had a mission, get in there, stay in there, monitor for whatever transactions they were interested in. And for some reason they lost access. Well, they were going to work until they got back in again. And that to me was, I really got that flavor of like, they really wanted to get in here, didn't they?
And you've got that great spreadsheet. It's color coded, showing the host names and the access. And if they wanted access, if they got access, you really are peering into exactly what these folks were doing at the NSA during the op.
Yeah.
It's impressive stuff. And with Swift as well, and with the bureaus, it's not just, well, we think it's not just transaction data, which itself is really interesting, but potentially also what we call KYC and AML in finance. So KYC is know your customer. So you can't just bank or do someone's banking. You need to know a little bit about them, maybe make sure they're not on a watch list or related to organized crime, anything of that nature. And to do that, you're basically doing a bit of vetting. So looking at their personal history, collecting evidence. And if that's something that EastNets had on their network and the NSA were able to access, that's, again, really rich material that an intelligence agency would want. And then with anti-money laundering as well, again, that's investigations into different transactions that might be suspicious. Again, really useful information for them if they're looking to understand the movement of money in that region of the world.
Yeah, who's funding who's behind whatever organizations. There's a lot to find out there.
And you kind of see back at this time, would that organization, even if they had a security team, maybe they did, maybe they didn't, would they have said, oh yeah, nation states, we need to worry about nation states? I'm not sure they would.
But that loss of trust, we've talked about that before, is paramount here, because now that's happened, right? That all of their internal information has been leaked all over the internet. Everybody's had a good look at it. Rando podcasters have years later been trawling through that information.
Those guys,
what a bunch of clowns. And there's that loss of trust must have been difficult for them, especially for organizations which obviously did have Western intelligence agencies in their threat model. Like, well, we don't want to work with you guys now. I mean, you guys have probably been hacked 6 ways to Sunday. So what the hell's going on?
Reputationally really difficult, right? It would apply to lots of companies today. And I think another potentially lazy form of analysis when talking about nation states is to say, and again, I've probably been guilty of this, well, if they want to get in, they will get in. So it's almost this kind of acceptance of defeat before you even begin the conversation about securing against it. Well, if the NSA or the GRE or whoever want to get into your network, they're going to get in. So there's no point trying. That's a really interesting statement. And how comfortable would a lot of companies be sharing that with their customers? We might get hacked by these people. It's too difficult. So
with their regulators, right? As you mentioned.
And so that's a really interesting angle where, particularly in finance, there's a lot of very heavy and sometimes sensible regulation around cybersecurity and what companies need to be doing. Would you put that in writing to a regulator? Yeah, we don't care about nation states. It's too difficult. Too tough. Not in the threat model.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, nothing bad would happen if you get hacked by a nation state, right? They wouldn't dump all of your information online. Well,
exactly. Yeah, and there's a few anecdotes kicking around the industry about, oh, so and so had a nation state compromise, but they were patching things on their behalf because they needed the network to be more stable, and they were doing basic maintenance. So yeah, maybe being popped by China is really useful. But it's not just stealing information. And we've seen that, how quick the world can move, Russia, Ukraine, how very quickly you can become in the firing line for a disruptive op. And maybe the final angle here, and that there's been a big case related to NotPetya only settled recently around, would something like cyber insurance cover an act of war? And the argument there was NotPetya was attributed to the Russian state, so it must be an act of war. Your insurance doesn't cover that. See you later. And I can't remember if they settled or what the actual conclusion was, but it went on for a long time.
It did. I think at the end they said that it didn't count. You can't say that just because you got hacked that it's an act of war. I think they wanted to look for like a kinetic angle to it.
Okay, nice. And that makes sense. But yeah, so there's a lot going on here, isn't there, when you talk about nation states? And yeah, it's not as simple as just saying, well, if they want to get in,
they're going to get in. And in this case, you would have probably said this about the NSA. And then you would probably also have been equally surprised to have found that information on GitHub.
Right? Yeah, exactly. You think they'd be good at it?
Yeah, interesting. So let's move on. So we can talk about the initial access a little bit here, because that's very interesting. Because back then, it was pretty cool when the first techniques came out that they were using attacks against security appliances. And I just love NSA code names. They're just amazing. Banana Glee. It's just wonderful. Zesty Leak. This kind of stuff. But effectively, they were breaking in through the Cisco ASAs. Now, that's the adaptive security appliance that's supposed to be protecting your network, not being leveraged as a point of entry into your network. And
horrible irony there, isn't there?
It's beautiful, I would say, as a red teamer. But you say what you want. But I think that's really interesting, because we've touched on this before, that today's nation state activity is tomorrow's criminal approach. And this is actually exactly what happened, because we saw then, Citrix bleed, we saw the Palo Altos have the issues, or the Pulse Secure stuff have issues. And there's been this litany of exploitation of perimeter devices, which we have touched on previously. But it's really good to see how it is exactly following that path, that the NSA were doing this decades ago, and obviously getting a lot out of it.
It's a sweet way in, right? You're not reliant on a user opening the thing or clicking the link or doing whatever. You're just straight onto the device from the outside.
It's deterministic. And I think that's the appeal, certainly for an organization like the NSA versus those probabilistic things. Now, phishing, you can say, yeah, phishing, you'll eventually get in. But timescales could be weeks, months. You don't really know. You might have very difficult targets to phish. Whereas this deterministic approach is, oh, they're running that Cisco ASA will exploit it, implant it. We have persistent access, and also no security monitoring typically, right?
And we talked about these devices before and the challenges with hardening them. And you, yeah, traditionally you wouldn't put another security device in front of your firewall to protect your firewall, because that's kind of the point of the firewall. And on the blue team side, depending how you prioritize, lots of folks talk about the human firewall and the need to invest heavily in user awareness and running phishing simulations and e-learning and point-in-time education. And they're all really useful things. But depending on the ratio and how you prioritize those, if you invest heavily in that kind of world, you might end up pretty good for phishing. But then if somebody comes along with an exploit for an edge device, the majority of your, in fact, probably all of your user awareness is redundant. And I'm not saying don't do it, but it's useful to think about prioritization.
Right.
Is that the most useful use of everyone's time? Because yeah, you can do some good stuff for that phishing initial access vector. But yeah, this attack, I don't think it even touched any way that user awareness could have helped.
Yeah, and this case is interesting because they bounced around inside the internal network, also exploiting the internal firewalls, and then ended up within or the ability to connect directly to the back end Oracle DBs, which had the data that they were interested in. So they didn't touch the sort of systems which we typically prioritize for security monitoring, and which I really like as a red team. I think, from a tradecraft perspective, I think that's really, really cool. So they didn't touch the domain controllers. They didn't try to touch user endpoints like the Windows machines. So that kind of approach of, we're going to look at the Windows event logs, or we're going to collect them, and we're going to rely on EDR or AV probably back then, right? But they just avoided all of that. They just slid past it all. And that is, and then of course they brought out the big guns, Eternal Blue, most likely, an incredible exploit which gave you remote system on a Windows machine inside of the operating system itself. So your endpoint protection system, most likely, it's different now, but most likely back then would not have seen anything. And they talked about that the machines they compromised, they had Symantec running on them, they had Kaspersky running on them. Didn't see anything.
And traditionally on servers, from my experience, the security is turned down because availability. So if your security tool interrupts a user endpoint, that's not ideal, but that's one user. If your EDR, your AV, whatever it may be, knocks a server offline, you're going to have a bad time. So yeah, traditionally there is less security, which there's a certain irony there, isn't there? I guess, we want to secure where users are. Absolutely. They're on the internet, they're reading email, they're doing bad things. Then where our really sensitive data is, or just our data and applications and services, yeah, sometimes that's less. And again, from my experience, desktop estates tend to be all right. We can patch those, we can upgrade them, move people to Windows 11, happy days.
Yeah.
The server world, oh my goodness, you lift the lid in most organizations, you'll find a lot of end of life. That's unfair. Maybe some end of life. It wouldn't surprise me to walk in and see 2008 R2 running for still lots of organizations, because there'll be an application which nobody owns or only works on that particular OS, and it's difficult to move, and they ain't being patched.
Yeah, and as attackers, we look for these things. We rely on those things being there because we don't want to attack the hard stuff. We want to attack the soft stuff. Like, a predator will attack, the sick or the young or the weak animals. Attackers function in the same way. You don't want to attack the fully patched, hardened machine you've just deployed. We want that abandoned, 2008 machine that's running something critical to the organization. You can't get off of it because it would cost too much money, because the application doesn't support the new operating system, but that company doesn't exist anymore, but you're still reliant on it.
Definitely. Yeah, that's a really nice way to think of it. I'm going to look at every 2008 server now thinking it's prey that's too old and too weak and needs to be taken out. And I really suggest anyone from the IT world listening to this just think about that, because I know traditionally we think about availability and, hey, if it's not broke, don't fix it. That server's still running. We'll do an upgrade, but it's on the roadmap. that could be a major vulnerability for you. And the optics post breach, when depending on the organization, there's an inquiry or a report or even a lawsuit, and it transpires you're running out of support, end of life, awful software.
Yeah, and
it's not going to look good.
And I think one of the interesting aspects to that is that it depends on what it's protecting, or not protecting, but what it's supporting, what it's running. In this case, it may have been behind multiple firewalls, but it might have been old at that time, whatever. But the fact is that was the asset the attacker cared about. So if you are running, you may have other effective protections in place, but if the asset which the attacker cares about is running a whole bunch of unsupported stuff, that's going to be really tricky.
And on the C2, they were coming through, was it compromised machines from other organizations?
Yeah. So they were redirecting through Japan, Taiwan, Kazakhstan. Interestingly, a lot of Solaris machines, by the looks of it, universities, academic organizations, probably stable, high uptime, high bandwidth links, minimal security configuration, security logging. I mean, it's a playground, right? You can just, and they had all of the tooling for all of that system. So they would connect from their operational machine through some unspecified VPN or whatever, but then, bounce through some external university and then end up at the target. So that's another, you might be hacked by them just because you're on the flight path to the target.
Yeah, and that's interesting reputationally as well, isn't it? If you detect it, or you get informed by government, or find out when Russia leak it on Pastebin that you were part of an NSA operation, that's still a breach, still a compromise, and you'd have to do full IR, notify customers. It would be messy.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. Yeah, that's a really interesting aspect to it. So the other sort of OPSEC thing was that they were pivoting through internal machines. Now, it's not clear whether that's for necessity, because the things didn't have direct internet access, and you kind of hope that they wouldn't. But it would also be quite a nice way of making it look like you're going through an internal system. And it's just an internal system talking to another internal system. Who would care?
Yeah. Yeah, and how would you, as the defender, know that's anomalous?
Yeah,
and there are ways, right? And sometimes there's tooling, or there's just good old fashioned. We talk about this a lot. Is knowing your infrastructure, because I know Rob Joyce in the next talk really labors that point, doesn't he? The reconnaissance that these folks do, and we've talked about it in other podcasts. And often it feels like the attacker knows the network better than the security team.
Definitely. Yeah. And you can see from the dump, right, that they've got all those Excel spreadsheets. They've got so much detail about the environment. They've got, CSVs. They've used internal tools inside the environment, DS query and so on, to generate this information. So they knew all the internal machines, IP addresses, host names, MAC addresses. They had, which ones had been implanted. They were tracking it. Although I have to say, just a whole bunch of Excel spreadsheets. I mean, they could have had, something a bit better than that. But
the world runs on Excel. It just proves the point, doesn't it? The world is running on Excel. NSA
TAO,
red teams
all about the Excel.
They're on Excel. Yeah, it's the only way. Yeah,
they really, they had a lot of information about the internal network, and they knew really all the detail of what was going on inside, which is pretty cool. And you also see another sort of OPSEC commentary about staying undetected. You can see in the op notes that they've provided, stolen. They have this phrase "audit dorked," which is quite fun, which is we've disabled the auditing. So they know how to get onto a machine, switch off the auditing, do whatever they want to do, switch it back on again. I mean, I've done that too. It's pretty cool. And it's a really, really difficult thing to deal with, because if you do it in a kind of smart way, you don't just turn it off and leave it off forever. You turn it off, do your malicious action, turn it back on again. And if you can do this It's very hard to spot even these small outages, because you have small outages anyway, generally speaking.
Yeah.
Somebody reboots the machine, the link goes down, machine's overloaded temporarily, and so you get these kind of holes. So how do you know that that 30-second gap is an attacker or not?
For a lot of blue teams, I would bet that you could just turn the login off for a bunch of machines and nobody would really notice. Their Splunk build might be marginally smaller. It'll still be massive. Because
Yeah.
it is difficult, and the configuration drift with security tooling is like the total cost of ownership of a security tool, if take logging as an example, is huge. And I think often we think of it in program terms of, well, we need to do monitoring. We want to store it for a year. Great. Okay, let's point all these different services at our logging server. Happy days, and let's move on. We've got it done. Okay, well, who's maintaining that? Who's investigating? To your point, when you lose a log source, what does that trigger? And is there a playbook or a process where somebody, and we talked about this before the show, that the need for tenacity in security engineering of saying, right, we've lost a log source. Who owns that? What's happened? Has it been rebooted, turned off, patched? It's like, what's going on there? It's honest work, but it's not glamorous, but it's important.
Yeah. And it's also interesting to see from the NSA side how much work they put into what I call like offense in depth. I mean, you guys get to have a defense in depth, which is a great phrase. So we're going to
Thank
take
you.
that. We're going to have offense in
You,
depth.
it works. You got it. It works.
They're compromising a whole bunch of different machines, and they're using a very wide array of tooling. So they were really prepared to be able to be adaptive, responsive to change. They had a bunch of Windows stuff. They had Solaris stuff. They had Cisco Juniper stuff. And they were able to respond to different configuration changes on these different machines. So, your capable attacker is not going to be a one-trick pony. They're going to be able to adapt to what you have in your environment. There's also some and that's why I think this leak is genuine. There's some red team comedy in there. There's one comment which is WTF, just dropped the connection when trying to install no bueno, which you're not going to fake that. And that is such the sort of thing that somebody in that position is going to write, because
Yeah.
we've had those kind of conversations as well, where you're on an op, you're doing something that's supposed to work, you've tried it 100 times in the lab, you run it live, it fails, and you got no idea why.
A very annoyed TAO operator somewhere.
Absolutely.
Their implant just is not happening. Well, I hope they figured it out. And I'd love to read the other side of this, which would be the IR. So I'm assuming EastNets found out about it from this leak, potentially.
They kind of denied it, I think, didn't they?
Nice. Deny. They should work in politics. But how do you begin? Like that kind of IR, I think a lot of traditional IR these days is just ransomware, and it's like you follow the pattern, you know what they've done before you even go in there, or you know where to look. But I got IR against doing instant response against a nation state attack with this level of sophistication and persistence. That's going to be, and recovery as well. This is something I've read a lot about recently in some of the public sector breaches who have shared a lot of detail is, okay, the eradication of the attacker is tricky, but then the recovery of all those systems where you regain the trust in your infrastructure, that's a long journey.
I think as well in this case, right? They probably didn't have a lot of trust in their infrastructure to begin with.
Maybe, yeah. Or they were very, I was going to say naive. I'll be generous and say optimistic. Yeah, might be a better term for these, just in case they're listening. I'm sure they're very good people working hard, just trying to get their IT going.
Cool. Shall we jump over to Rob Joyce's presentation a little bit and talk about how commentary he makes and how that would have applied or not applied in this case?
Yeah, definitely. And he's a really interesting guy, right? So as you were saying earlier, so we just talked about EastNets, which is an NSA compromise of this organization, this SWIFT bureau in the Middle East. And Rob Joyce ran the organization that did that breach. So we've got this lovely two sides. And he was this is back in 2016, very open at a conference about kind of what those folks do and how we can defend against it. And maybe most interesting, brace yourself, listener, it's not that sexy and exciting. Can I say that?
Yeah. And he really nails it, I think. I think this is great advice. And it's an advice that comes from a lot of offensive experience. And I think that's very much worth paying attention to. So yeah, he kicks off with saying, if you want to protect your network, you have to know your network. I mean, the risk of sounding like a stuck record, we kind of talked about this one already, but it just goes to show how important that work is. And as you said, it's not the most glamorous stuff. It's not deploying, a new funky security appliance, or getting some new cloud service. It's laborious, detailed, often monotonous and boring work.
Yep. Running scans, be it Mmap or some other tool, looking at that, trying to figure out, is that in our CMDB? If you've got a CMDB, who owns that? Is it maintained? Is it being looked after? Does it get patched? It's not very exciting. I think it can lead to some really interesting findings, finding databases and authentication, or particularly sensitive files on file shares that shouldn't be there for everyone to see. But it's one I reflect on often, because it never feels like you make the time or you have the time to do that work. But then we've got the head of TAO here saying the attacker's going to do it.
Yeah,
So
and we do.
You should probably try, right?
We absolutely do, because we have to. So when we start an engagement, we're coming into an environment that potentially we've never even seen before. But we have a goal, we've been given a goal, so we've got to find it. So we will explore, potential paths to find that treasure, that gold at the end of the rainbow. And in order to do that, you have to get to know the network. We're not doing it because it's fun or because we want to. We're lazy, probably lazier than anybody else, but we have to do it. So that means we have to put in that grunt work. And because we know what our goal is, we're very, very motivated. We want to succeed. We want to, we want to win, whatever that is for any particular operation. So we are really motivated. I think it's difficult potentially, correct me if I'm wrong, but to motivate the blue side to be as proactive about this as the red side is.
Often particularly if you're in a regulated industry, you've got enough audit actions and other things.
The sigh.
Enough, big things to keep you busy. No. And maybe if there's an auditor listening to this, or somebody that works for a second line risk team, what a fantastic question to ask your first line security folks. What does our network look like? And if that can't be answered, that's a great action. Go away and figure it out.
Yeah.
That's what attackers are doing.
Yeah. And Rob Joyce also comments about the open source side of things as well, which is quite interesting. The external attack surface, effectively. There's a lot of detail there. I've spent a lot of time doing OSINT over the years, and it's surprising often what you can find.
I'll put my hand up and say, in a previous job, I was looking at some attack surface management tooling. So basically it just enumerates your attack surface. And there were some real surprises, the kind of surprises you act on straight away.
Yeah. I bet.
Yeah. Yeah. And I was not ignorant before, but I thought it was all pretty good until this thing fired up. I thought, and just to be fully transparent, you could have found it using open source tooling.
Oh, yeah.
This wasn't anything, really sophisticated or secret. It just something out there on the internet that should not have been there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Happens.
Yeah, absolutely.
So recon really important. And then 0 days, not always needed.
Yeah, this is an interesting one, because in the EastNets dump, they're all about the 0 days. They're exploiting the Cisco boxes, they're using Eternal Blue, all that kind of jazz. So sometimes they are needed. And I was wondering about this, because that kind of contradiction in advice is maybe they had a particular time pressure, right? They needed that information to support a particular other operation.
Maybe EastNets was the 1%. Or the the 5% they drop a 0 day on. Everything else, they're just swanning in there with default creds or a bit of phishing, and away we go.
But I do agree that I don't generally, I'm not really interested in using exploits. It's usually they're big, they're loud, they're messy, they are often unreliable, and the solution to them is very straightforward, which is to patch. So I don't really like that so much as an attacker. Valid credentials are much more appealing to me, because don't pick the lock if you can find the key. It looks like normal activity, or you can make it look like normal activity very often, and they will They give you that access for as long as the credentials are valid for. That often gives you privileged access, which is great. And it just looks great. SSH straight in, RDP straight in. This is great, rather than like, oh, I brought some clunky exploit out. And how do you patch against that as well, right? Because untangling that Gordian knot of privileged access is potentially decades of work, as opposed to Microsoft applied the patch, you've got to reboot your machine, done.
And we're done. Yeah. And he talks later, doesn't he, about least privilege and the how I don't think he goes into this much detail, but we often just give out too much. And people guard it. And this is another blue team realization I've had is it feels like it's something easy to do. And I've often said this to people, just enumerate your domain admins and then start trying to remove them. This is a good place to start. That is difficult. And when we see breaches where privilege is abused and it turns out that everyone had the privilege or it was widely shared, people go, oh, what a dumb thing to do. Try going into an organization and removing it. It's honest work, but it's not easy. And it's a journey, and it needs a lot of, sometimes softly, bit of influence, bit of niceness. Other times you do wonder, is it easier just to let the breach happen and then we'll do it all during the IR? And my life will be easier.
It's very challenging because it touches on so many different things, not just technical stuff, political stuff. So there's all kinds of cultural things, ways of working, established practices.
And Rob talks about lots of the things that I think are sensible, and the template for security has been out for a long time. I think that the things that we can do to be secure. So it's not like it's magic or a mystery. We need to patch. Application allow listing is really good. We need least privilege. EDR is quite handy. We need to all these different things. It's the tough bit, and I think why people keep having issues is politically, it's sometimes very difficult to do. One thing that caught my eye in his advice was the Emmet, I pronounced that right, the exploitation mitigation tool. And that's a really nice example of a feature. On the blue team side, I've hit this many times where you think, this is a great feature we want to turn on. I really encourage all blue teamers to learn the skill of how to do that under change control, very gradually, well tested, well documented. Because a lot of the time, from my experience, your IT team will not want to do that. No matter what it is, there'll have to be a lot of reassurance, justification of why you want to do this new thing that we've not done yet and hasn't caused us a problem and could break everything.
Right.
Takes a lot of influence. Often. I think that's invisible.
And what's interesting with the Emmet example as well is that's one of the few things where it went from being an add-on for Windows 7 to being built into Windows 10 and beyond. So they actually were able to get that kind of additional enhanced exploit mitigation work into the default. It's now everywhere. And that's now something that is available to all customers, which is a fantastic thing. It's not a magic bullet. There's still plenty of exploits that happen, but still, what a great thing to have, for that additional enhancement can now be baked into the OS. So we were just talking about how we can enable all of those great security features and then also disable them.
Absolutely, yeah. Something's not working. Let's remove EDR, toggle off all the good security stuff. And I totally get it, because IT teams are there for availability a lot of the time, and they're under pressure, and there's P2 and P1 incidents, and people need their stuff to work. But certainly in my experience, it's a very, very common kind of first step in fault finding would be, for example, to remove EDR or to look for the latest changes to that machine and roll those back. And that's all sensible stuff. But often, again, in my experience, we don't then, a couple of things, we don't revisit. So if it transpires that's not the thing that broke it, we don't then go reinstall EDR. But then secondly, security doesn't necessarily get notified, or we're not monitoring our baselines for configuration drift or some sort of reversion of a security feature or item that we've configured. And again, like lots of things we talked about, it's just good, honest work. It's not AI, ML in the cloud on the dark web.
Can't ChatGPT solve this for me? Rob Joyce says this in the talk, right? He says, don't assume a crack is too small to be noticed or too small to be exploited. And I think that really, that's really insightful there, what you were just saying. Also for, we're just exposing this machine to the internet for just a short period of time. We are looking for those things, and we want to know when, oh, you've configured remote access to your internal asset for your vendor. Well, I mean, as a commercial red team, typically not a lot we can do about that. But for these kind of, either criminal or nation state ones, they can exploit the vendor and just be sitting there. So I mean, these, Team Viewer, AnyConnect, this kind of stuff. You're just
So common.
going to be lurking there, waiting
Yeah.
for them to establish that, to deal with, troubleshoot their file storage array, to troubleshoot their data lake, whatever internal thing that you care about. And then when that pops up, over you go.
You're in. And on the IT side, we're not helped either. If you look at lots of tools have this, their installation guide includes excluding the paths for their files from things like EDR and AV.
Well, you've had a problem once. And so just better if you just turn it off.
Just exclude it. Life's easier. And that's a great example, as Rob was talking about, as you say, those cracks. And they're everywhere. And a lot of blue team stuff is just the prioritization, just trying to find the big ticket items. And I think a lot of them are stuff like this. It's not glamorous or exciting. It's just staying on top of what you've got. And if you're in an organization with thousands of machines and lots of users, that's tricky.
Yeah. And
right.
The other thing that he says, which I think is really valid for the EastNets situation, is he says, you have to have some processes and plans to understand what's normal inside of your network. And I think that's the bit where his advice really, dovetails with the EastNets operation, because you could say, looking at what happened, well, they used a bunch of ODE, they came in through the perimeter devices, they used Eternal Blue, this kind of stuff. And I think it's okay to say, yeah, well, actually, chances are not good that we would have caught that. But they were running a whole bunch of SQL queries against the Oracle backend DBs, and that didn't trigger any alarms. So people didn't, or so it seems, people didn't notice that was happening. I think in some organizations, they're really sensitive to that kind of stuff. If the DB starts spiking, the DBAs are, and they are a ruthless bunch, deservedly so, right? They have a fearsome reputation. They'll be like, what in God's name is happening? Like the Postgres dev who caught the XZ backdoor because of the performance impact to SSH.
That's an incredible story. Because it wasn't looking for a security issue. It's the performance, wasn't it?
Yeah, because he was like, it's taking too long. There's 200 milliseconds here that shouldn't be there. I'm all over this. And just like rip the thing to shreds. And if people are doing that, it means that these systems are not being maintained or not being observed in the right way. And I think it really goes back to, why should I care about nation states? Well, maybe you don't have to care about the whole totality of nation states, but this kind of thing, which is, do you care about an attacker running unauthorized queries against your SQL DBs, which are containing all of your most sensitive data? I think you probably do.
Yeah, and that's the kind of thing criminals might do. Maybe other categories of threat actor as well.
Yeah,
it captures a lot of them. There was a couple of other things in the advice as well, which I thought were interesting. The suggestion for segmentation, which I've heard repeatedly and totally agree with. I've only ever seen it done in a few shops where you take a legacy network, and from what I saw, it was a big uplift to then go segment the things.
That is one of the things that I absolutely hate as an attacker, is a well-segmented network.
So maybe worth it then.
It is, in my opinion, as an attacker. So, I'm not interested in your costs or political struggles, but as an attacker, that's a control that really upsets me. And the reason is because it comes in at the very bottom of the networking stack. So if I can talk to the machine, but you've got some, access control, some web app that does some stuff, I don't really care about that. But if I can't talk to the machine, what am I going to do? And those, in my experience, effective security comes by reducing the security decisions to these very simple binary setups, right? Can I send a packet to the machine? Yes or no? If the answer is no, what the hell am I going to do? I've got a lot of work to do to find those points. And they usually exist, those crossing over points, right? Where I can jump from one network to another. We saw that in the hacking team one, how much work they had to do to find that point where they could jump from the corporate LAN to the secured internal network. And well segmented networks really make these things difficult because I can't even talk to it. So I can't use any of my fancy tricks. And that, I think, is the real the power of that control. And I understand it's difficult, but honestly, it's really worth it.
That's a really great perspective from the red side, isn't it? Yeah. Where instinctively from the blue team world, I'm thinking, oh, that's potentially very challenging, but maybe worth it in terms of prioritization and cost.
Yeah, and
get it done.
And it also helps you with things like just making stuff work well, because it can't interfere with other networks because it can't talk to other networks. So you get a lot of other like ancillary side benefits as well from that kind of approach, I think.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. The other things he was suggesting is more patching and application allow listing, which I've never heard of before. So that was useful for them to
I mean, that's nation state level stuff, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. No, really, really, really good advice. Patching, we've talked about so much before, right? And I think automating that's awesome if you can. Certainly, again, on the blue team side, I think there'd be a lot of concern from an IT team. And obviously, you can stagger the automation of patching and use things like rings to do small groups and then let it do its thing over time. But the first question will always be, how is this tested? How do we roll it back? What do you mean it's automated? And we're getting better at it, I think. But patching OSs is doable. Patching all your applications as well, that can become tricky, especially when the patch isn't a patch. It's a registry key or it's some obscure configuration change. I actually I ended up patching a system myself just this week. And the upgrade path, I won't give any more detail, but the upgrade path sucked. It was not a straightforward thing to do.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many issues with things, when you've got these very, very complicated like enterprise systems, which is, running on 33 different runtimes and all have to be at appropriate version levels. Otherwise, everything just falls to pieces. That kind of stuff, I see technology is usually garbage and makes it incredibly hard for, blue teams to do their job of protecting the organization because it's just so hard.
And it sounds like I'm being very like defeatist, but I think it comes back to that point on the blue team side, the need for that drive and the tenacity to push and try and get these things done. Obviously using with empathy and complying with your organization's values and not being a complete dick. But it's not easy. And I think sometimes maybe we do paint that picture that, you just need to patch or come work for the blue team. You can do all these great things, and you absolutely can.
One of the interesting things he says to that point is he says that the attacker is really motivated. And as attackers, we want to win. Are you equally as motivated to patch, configure, harden, tweak? And that's
a
challenging
wonderful
problem.
statement, definitely. And that's a really good one for any security leaders listening to this to reflect on. Say, do we have the same drive as the folks trying to attack us? And if not, why not?
Yeah, and my guys are really motivated. We really want to win.
It's really annoying.
And we have those very short feedback loops, right? That we try something, it doesn't work. We get that experience very, very quickly. Whereas on the blue side, my understanding is more that you deploy stuff, you hope for the best, but your feedback loop could be like deploy the EDR, and it's not until 2 years later it fails because somebody was using some bypass they got from GitHub that you go, well, actually, it's not really working as well as we expected.
And there is more, I guess, process and tooling in that space, breach and attack simulation, control validation. But then it's more shiny. It's not necessarily shiny tooling, but it's more things for us folks to do on the blue team side.
Oh, and another dashboard, finally.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and I've used some of that tooling, and some of it's awesome.
Oh, yeah.
But it needs to be driven. And then it needs to be actioned. And I'm not saying we should not look for things because then we might need to fix it. That's not at all what I'm saying. But the whole, again, that total cost of ownership of something like an EDR, got to deploy it, maintain it, ensure it's working, ensure it's deployed everywhere is big. Not
It's
saying
like
don't do it, but
it's a bit like logging, right? That you need to have a detection use case established before you turn on a log source. And we've seen it so many times that the advice is turn on all the logs, and then you can decide like what you want to,
log all the things,
what you
man. Yeah, just
and
those Splunk bills. Oof. In fact,
it's
is that advice from Splunk?
did a Splunk write this?
Yeah, the
Yeah,
Steam salesperson told me.
yeah. Well, I mean, but I've seen this is that's the advice that's
Yeah.
given by
No, I've
vendors,
seen it.
and you can't do that because you end up drowning in one of my favorite log sources that I've seen was the association and disassociation of access points, wireless access points. There's some actionable log sourcing for you
Yeah,
right
sounds
there.
useful. Yeah, is that leveraged by attackers often? I do see one argument, and it's not fiscally very responsible, of log a bunch of sensible things, throw it in Steam for a year. So when you have IR, you've got data. And I kind of see that, but it still needs thought, right? And consider what are we going to log and keep for a year? Just EDR, DNS, web
Well,
browsing, email,
the thing
and
is
all that
that
adds up.
that comes at a cost, and I don't just mean the financial one, but unless you're being very aggressive about hiving that stuff off to some kind of cold storage or something like that, if you want to query your logs, your DNS logs, your Windows event logs, your audit D logs, if you've put every single thing possible in there, guess what? That's going to take a lot of time, and you're going to find it very difficult, especially if you need to do searches for things which are not very, very tightly defined. That stuff is just, you put it into an Elasticsearch cluster, and you're just going to watch it grind to a halt because you've just put in every single scrap of available data into that. You're like, well, we're logging all of these things. Yeah, but if you can't retrieve anything, what's the point?
And it reminds me a little bit, I think, as a comparison to backups, where we talk about backups are really sensible, login's really sensible, but we need to test our backups work. I wonder how many shops are going back to go, oh, that log source from 10 months ago, is it working? Is it being stored? Because if you find out it's not during IR, that's not ideal.
Yeah, and I've seen log sources from the sort of big stuff which is considered to be very, very cool and happening and hip and trendy these days. And I look at it and I just think, well, it's incredibly comprehensive, right? It's logging every single, system call, file access, everything. And then I look at it and go, okay, well, how are they going to actually find me in these logs? How are they going to differentiate that small malicious action I'm going to be performing from this ocean of just noise? And then I'm glad that I'm a red teamer and it's not my job.
Yeah, I'm starting to reconsider my career choices. I'm joking. I love it. I absolutely love it. We should probably wrap up. Do you think it's time for an outro?
Yeah. I think so. Yeah. I mean, so maybe it's worth just having a quick think about, like, what did you take away from this? I mean, now that we've had a chance to look at the red team side, the blue team side, we're looking at a nation state attacker. We're looking at the real detail of the ops, and we've had that great advice from Rob Joyce. What do you take away from it, Steve?
One main thing. Well, I think there's many things. I could list off a few points, but the main one is that one about know your network, or invest time to understand it and know it and compare it to the network diagram and have that understanding. I think it's a great thing for blue teamers to do.
You have a network diagram?
Yeah, I wrote it in crayon last week. I'll show you.
It's just a box with a single arrow that says the internet.
yeah, it's a box up to a cloud. The end. That is such good advice, isn't it? And yeah, something that a blue team could go do in minutes, right? Spin up a map, start that process. It would take longer than that, but you could start the ball rolling. You could go from 0 to 1 in a short space of time. And I think in the midst of IR is not when you want to suddenly discover you're running things you don't necessarily know about. Now, I guess the challenge with that is, where do you stop? You could pull on all those threads and spend a lot of time doing that. But I think some phase one network enumeration and understanding what you're dealing with, hackers are doing it. Should probably spend some time doing it yourself. I'm definitely going to take that away and potentially do it myself. See if I get detected.
Yeah, absolutely. That's already be quite an interesting experience, right? I think
But
from
how
my
about you? What did you? Yeah, what did you pick up
yeah.
from this?
So I'm going to take the red team side, kind of slightly obviously here, but I think the thing that I took away the most was the OPSEC level of the attacker here, and I think that's an inspiration. I think to all red teams. I think obviously these guys are top of the game, so it's not too surprising. But the way that each step on their kill chain was very considered. They had built into their attack techniques, operational security. They were pivoting through multiple machines. They were doctoring the security logs so that they couldn't be detected. They were moving in areas of the network which are typically not as well monitored. So coming in through the perimeter devices, pivoting through firewalls, that kind of thing. And I think that's something it's really worth paying attention to in terms of that tradecraft as a red teamer. So when you are executing an attack, you don't want to be caught by something dumb and be kicked out. You want to give the best test that you can to whoever your client is, wherever your customer is. And so paying attention to these small details and baking them into how you're doing your attack, not only the tooling that you're doing, but also your operational practices requires quite a bit of discipline, but I think it's worth it.
That's a great point, and a great one maybe to end on. I've loved the discussion. This is a wonderful attack to talk about with the detail combined with the advice from Rob Joyce as well. Yeah, it's been a really good discussion. I've learned a lot.
Yeah, same here. Thanks a lot, Steve.
Thanks, Richard. See you next time.